He didn't whisper it. He declared it. Ken Burns, the man, whose films practically define how America remembers itself, looked straight into camera and said that the creation of the United States of America is the most important event since the birth of Christ. Not one of the most important, but the most important. And that line alone stopped people cold. Because in a country where every subject turns into a battlefield, religion, politics, history, identity, to say this moment, 1776, sits second only to the birth of Jesus Christ, that was explosive. It's the kind of statement that forces you to ask, is this filmmaker saying America isn't just a nation, but a kind of mythic miracle? Burns says the revolution wasn't just a chain of battles. It was a creation moment, a cosmic flashpoint where a new type of human idea suddenly existed. And when he talks about it, his own voice shifts, like he's talking about something alive. He calls it a sun, a force still burning. But that was only the beginning. Because Ken Burns insists most people misunderstand the revolution entirely. He says we think of the American Revolution like a calendar event, 1775 to 1783. Uniforms, muskets, battles, victory. But he points to one of the most overlooked statements in early American history. A line from founding father Benjamin Rush in 1787, the American War is over. But this is far from being the case. With the American Revolution, Rush was saying something most history textbooks never teach children. The real revolution came after the war. The fighting was just Act 1. The true revolution was the chaos of inventing a government from scratch, convincing entire colonies who saw each other as foreign strangers to suddenly say, "We are one." It wasn't about winning independence. It was about figuring out how to use it. And what Burns is quietly telling us is this: that battle is still happening. The war ended. The revolution didn't. And what Burns reveals next changes the way you see the founders themselves. Because this isn't just some random commentator giving a hot take. This is Ken Burns, the filmmaker who literally shaped the way millions of Americans see their own history. He's the reason people still talk about the Civil War with that slow, haunting violin sound in their heads. He's the reason baseball isn't just a sport. It's a cultural mirror. He's the reason jazz isn't just music. It's an American heartbeat. Burns doesn't do nostalgia. He refuses to sugarcoat. And unlike the patriotic highlight reel version of history, he digs into the uncomfortable, the contradictory, the messy. Inside his editing room, right above the workspace, there's a sign that simply says, "It's complicated." And that's not decoration. That's the thesis of his entire career. Good history isn't about making heroes glow or villains hiss. Good history is the willingness to stare at the uncomfortable parts without looking away, and still finding the meaning inside them. Burns believes America's origin story isn't simple, and the moment you think it is, you've already lost the truth. And nowhere is that more obvious than when he talks about George Washington. Because Ken Burns refuses to turn the founders into marble statues. When he looks at George Washington, he sees a man who lived inside a contradiction so large it could rip a country apart. Washington, the general who became the symbol of liberty, was also a slave owner. Imagine the weight of that paradox. He was fighting for universal liberty in a world where he personally held human beings in bondage. And yet, historian Annette Gordon-Reed says something most people never hear in classrooms. Without Washington, there is no America. Why? Because Washington wasn't just leading armies. He was convincing 13 separate colonies, who saw each other as different nations, to believe they had something in common. People in Georgia and people in Massachusetts were basically foreigners to each other. Different cultures, different economies, different identities. But Washington somehow embodied a shared future, not just in speeches, but in presence. He didn't unite them with slogans. He united them by existing as the person they could all point to and say, "Okay, that's us." Burns sees that contradiction as the engine that powered the entire experiment. America was born through ideals bigger than the people who held them, and flawed humans who tried anyway. And that brings us to the part that stings the most. Because Ken Burns says this entire story only matters if it applies to right now. And here's where Burns hits the nerve that makes people uncomfortable. He says America isn't suddenly in crisis today. America has always been in crisis. He doesn't talk about the revolution like a relic locked behind museum glass. He talks about it like a mirror, reflecting every argument we're still having right now. Because this new film wasn't made during some peaceful golden age. It was conceived in 2015 and produced through some of the most volatile social and political years in recent memory. Culture wars, protests, polarization, identity battles, elections that split friendships, news cycles that fried everyone's nerves. Burns says this is actually the American pattern. The revolution wasn't a moment that happened and ended. It's a process we're still trapped inside. He calls it a perpetual crisis. The same friction that existed in 1776. Who are we? Who belongs? What is freedom? Who decides the narrative? Woody is still burning under every headline today, and that leads to his most emotional belief. The idea that America's healing might not be found in new ideas, but in rediscovering the original sentence that started everything. And then, Ken Burns drops the line that feels less like history and more like a love letter to possibility. He says the second sentence of the Declaration of Independence, "We hold these truths to be self-evident," is the second most important sentence in the English language, right after "I love you." Think about the weight of that. He's telling us that the foundation of this country wasn't self-evident at all. Those truths, equality, rights, humanity, didn't exist naturally. They had to be invented, debated, argued into existence, fought for, adjusted, extended, little by little, generation by generation. Burns believes that's why looking backward isn't nostalgia, it's survival. Because if we forget where those truths came from, we forget how fragile they've always been. And his hope, the core thesis of his entire message, is surprisingly human. Maybe the way forward is to return to the origin story. Not to idealize it, but to remember that the other person, the person who disagrees with you, is not automatically the enemy. He thinks that if Americans relearn that one principle, the revolution might actually keep working. So when Ken Burns finishes talking, it's not really about 1776 anymore. It's about right now. He isn't warning us about foreign armies or political opponents. He's warning us about something more silent and more dangerous. The day Americans stop listening to each other. Because disagreement was always part of this experiment. Conflict was baked into the design. The revolution was born from argument, not agreement. So the enemy isn't the person on the other side of the conversation. The enemy is the moment we choose to stop having one. And when Burns compares America's creation to something on the scale of biblical history, he's doing it because he thinks the storm of our future is still connected to the spark of our beginning. Maybe the biggest hurricane America is facing isn't coming from outside our borders at all. Maybe it's the unfinished revolution still spinning inside us, the same one that began 250+ years ago. Because if this origin narrative was powerful enough to create a country, maybe returning to it is powerful enough to keep one.